Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Steve DeWitt. I'm the Deputy Executive Director with the Association for Career and Technical Education, or ACTE. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing the broad field of CTE practitioners in secondary and post-secondary education. Thank you for joining today. We know this is going to be a very informative introduction to the CTE Research Network and causal impact and other methodologies. I'm looking forward to it myself. We'll be discussing some of the specific work that the CTE Research Network is doing and that the researchers themselves are undertaking, and we have a terrific panel. Before we begin, we'd like to do a quick poll to get a sense of where everybody is related to their roles. And so Brandy Hondras is going to pull that up for us, and we'll give you just a minute or so to answer. And maybe just another 10 seconds or so. Great. And Brandy, are you able, there, you right on cue. So you can see we have a number of secondary administrators with us, a few post-secondary as well, a lot of researchers, great, and some others like me. Well, we are, let's see, Brandy, I just lost my notes, so let me go back. Apologies, everyone. So I wanted to say that as we do progress through the webinar, please don't hesitate to share your questions in the chat feature. We really want to have a robust conversation about these topics. We know it's not something that most of our educators are familiar with. And I know it's hard for some people to post a question. They don't like to do that, but please do. It really helps the conversation and moves us forward. We are also going to be posting this online seminar. We're recording it currently, and we'll be posting it on the ACTE website. It'll be posted under our professional development tab, which is at the top of our website, acteonline.org. And then you'll go to the to the online learning sub-tab once you hover over professional development. And you'll see all of our list of ACTE online webinars or ACTE online seminars. You'll see that link and just click on there. We'll have it available at least for the next probably year. It'll be open to everyone, so please feel free to come back. So let's advance to the second slide, and I want to talk just a moment about the CTE Research Network. The network's mission is to, the CTE Research Network seeks to expand the evidence base on the impact of CTE programs on student outcomes. And what I just stated is the mission statement. This is a 5-year initiative that began in 2018 and will be running, is supported rather by the Institute of Education Sciences at the U.S. Department of Education, with funds provided under the Carl D. Perkins Career and Technical Education Act. The American Institutes for Research, or AIR, and its partners, ACTE, JFF, and Vanderbilt University, serve as the CTE Research Network lead to provide network administration and coordination, as well as research training and dissemination to increase the number and quality of CTE impact evaluations. It also works to strengthen the field's research capacity, and that's a big part of why we're doing this today. We want to make sure that the field of CTE practitioners are involved in this project. An important role of the network is bringing together research teams related to the mission. And as network members, the research teams participate in collaborative activities to share findings, strengthen their research, and learn from one another. And I'll note that all of today's panelists are from those research teams, so this is a terrific opportunity to hear firsthand from their knowledge and experience. So you can find more information about the CTE Research Network and its activities at cteresearchnetwork.org. And Brandy, if you could advance to the next slide, I just wanted to talk about one specific activity that the network is currently working on. It's a set of practitioner training modules that will be released later this year or early next year. And as mentioned earlier, the main mission of the network is to expand the evidence base. So related to that, we want to bring CTE practitioners and researchers together to better share research and understand research needs. research can be used in so many different ways to inform policy, to understand program effects, and to drive program improvement. But practitioners, as we mentioned, do not always necessarily have a research background. So the network wants to expand and support practitioners in understanding and using not just research, but causal research. And if you could advance one more time, this gives you a bit of an overview of what the module components will look like. Each module is being developed and will be about 45 minutes to an hour in length. They will be self-contained, but they do build in complexity, and later modules draw from terminology and definitions in the earlier ones. So please keep an eye out on that research network, the CTE Research Network website, as well as ACTE's website. We'll be promoting this, these modules and information as they move forward. And the last slide on this, on these module components, reference the 6 areas that we'll be focused on. Each module, I'm sorry, and just one final note, I didn't want to miss this, is that these can be viewed sequentially, but the suggestion is that you consider doing so if you plan to complete the entire series. So I guess you really need to follow that order in order for them to be useful. So that's it for me. Next, I want to introduce Dr. Michelle Conrad, who's with the University of Central Missouri. Dr. Conrad and UCM have been really terrific partners with ACTE. She has worked on a number of our initiatives related to research and practice. And Dr. Conrad will be setting the stage with some broad definition and background on this topic of causal research. So Dr. Conrad?
Thank you, Steve. Before we jump into our panel today, we do want to make sure to review some research terminology. And I think, Steve, you're going to operate the slides for me. There we go. So descriptive research seeks to describe what is currently happening in a program or school. So some descriptive examples might be percentages of students of different races or ethnicities who participate in CTE program areas, or we might describe the implementation of a career pathways initiative. Correlational research seeks to determine whether there is a relationship between 2 or more variables. So some examples in CTE might be whether a student's gender is associated with scores in CTSO competitions or on industry recognized credentials. Or we might look at whether the number of work-based learning hours completed relates to later career satisfaction. When we talk about causal research, it seeks to determine whether 1 or more variables caused or did not cause a change in another variable. So causal examples might be whether enrollment in a career academy impacted high school completion, or whether participation in a work-based learning program changed future employment and earnings. So why is causal research important in CTE? It is designed to show cause and effect. So in this way, if it can show if CTE programming has changed students' educational and workforce outcomes, we can better inform educators, policymakers, and the public about the effectiveness of CTE programs. Some additional key terms, and there are some examples that you can read on the screen. I won't read all of those to you, but intervention or treatment group is a group of people who actually participate in the program or initiative being studied. And the comparison or control group would be the group of people with similar characteristics to the intervention or treatment group, but do not participate in the program or initiative. An experimental design, we go to the next slide, is a study in which people are randomly assigned to the intervention or comparison group. Where a quasi-experimental design may not be randomized, but it can mimic randomization. Students who randomly miss the opportunity to participate in a treatment intervention, such as by losing an opportunity via lottery or just missing a required test score threshold for participation. That was the example. Confounder is a variable other than the variables being studied that could be responsible for a change in outcomes. And then counterfactual what would have happened to the treatment group in the absence of the intervention. So we will turn to our panelists today. Dr. Sean Doherty is the co-principal investigator of the CTE Research Network and associate professor of public policy and education in the Department of Leadership, Policy, and Organizations at Vanderbilt University. Dr. Crystal Binloss is a senior associate at K-12 in the K-12 education policy area and director of outreach, diversity, and inclusion at MDRC. And Dr. Julie Edmonds is the program director for the SERVE Center at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Thank you all for being here today with us. Sean, if you could start a little bit, you're the co-principal investigator. Can you share a little more about what a principal investigator does on a research project, as well as some of your specific responsibilities related to the CTE Research Network?
Sure. Good afternoon or good morning, and thanks for having me. So a principal investigator in general, I'd say on a research project is responsible for a number of things, a lot of them around management and coordination of the project. So the overall research process as proposed when you started or applied for funding, assembling and managing the team, communicating with team members, managing the grant and grant reporting. So that includes, supporting the financial accounting expenditures and then reporting to the funder. And then I think probably most importantly, though not always the largest share of time, is bringing substantive expertise, leadership to the research design and plan implementation. And then specifically with respect to the research network, it's a little different with the research network than a traditional research project, insofar as we have a number of activities that are aligned with exactly what you and Steve laid out at the top of the webinar. And so I'll just add that based on the goals of expanding the pool of high quality causal research being done and increasing relevance to the field, a lot of the emphasis is around bringing researchers together like we have today that are doing this work, training folks who are interested and who are doing applied work to have a better sense of the methods and the research findings, and three, helping develop the next generation of researchers. And so those latter points are more central to my role in terms of helping to develop and implement the training that we did this past summer and that we'll do in subsequent summers, and then to supervise and mentor postdocs and graduate students at Vanderbilt to help build that pipeline. Of course, working in conjunction with the whole team. This is just where my expertise is being brought in with the leadership.
Great, thank you. And I know you're each leading various network research projects. So maybe Sean, if you could start, if you want to continue and provide us an overview of those projects, of your projects, their importance, as well as maybe any findings, if you have any yet.
Sure. I think, though, correct me if I'm wrong, we'll go in sequence and talk about our respective projects. Is that
Yes.
right? Okay, so,
yes,
so I'll focus on, so in addition to being a part of the network leadership, the way I'm also involved is I'm the PI, principal investigator, on a project to study the Connecticut technical high school system. This is a statewide system of technical high schools where students apply to attend the technical high schools as a school of choice, a public school of choice, but that's not tied to their residentially assigned school. And so students from all across Connecticut can apply to any one of the 16 schools in our study, but they're so popular statewide that they get more applicants than they can accommodate. And so there's an application process and an application score that's given to each applicant based on their middle school test scores and grades, middle school discipline and attendance records. And the criteria have changed over time, but that gives you a sense. And then students are ranked in descending order on this application criteria, and then offered spots at the schools to which they've applied until the school runs out of seats. And so this constitutes a quasi-experimental design and allows us to use what's called a regression discontinuity, where the fact that the students have been lined up in order, and then there's a cutoff where they run out of seats. We can compare students who just missed the cutoff and didn't attend the school they applied to otherwise similar students who just got in and attended that school. And then it only allows us to say something about students at the cutoff, but it's sort of second only to a regression discontinuity, or sorry, to a randomized control trial, which we'll talk about in a bit in terms of its ability to support causal inference. And so it gives us a really good estimate of the effect of getting into and attending those schools for students near that cutoff. And we find really large positive effects on high school graduation, on employment, and on earnings, and no difference in college participation, all by age 23, though the high school graduation impacts happen kind of right at on-time graduation. We also find that there's positive effects on test scores, so the state required test score in 11th grade, and on attendance in 9th grade. So this is like a notoriously important transition part of the educational experience, and we find positive effects of getting into these schools there. Importantly, we only find effects for boys. So there are pretty precise zero estimates for girls. That's not necessarily good news. It's good news for the boys. The silver lining, we think, for the girls is that the girls who don't get into the technical high schools have better outcomes in general than the boys who don't get in. And so it's in part the schools don't have the same effect as they do for boys, but in part because the sort of residentially assigned high schools appear to do better for the girls, all else equal, than for the boys. So I'll pause there. But.
Great, thank you for sharing. Crystal, do you want to share the work that you've been working on?
Sure, thank you, Michelle. So thank you, everyone. It's nice to be here this morning, afternoon, as Sean said. So I'm from MDRC, and we are studying the PTEC, the New York City PTEC 914 model. And so this is an early college and career high school model that aims to prepare students for both college and career through partnerships between high schools, local colleges, and employer partners. And so students take an integrated sequence of coursework while they're also being exposed to work-based learning experiences. They graduate typically within a 6-year time frame with both a high school diploma and a 2-year degree in a STEM discipline, and that's a degree that they receive at no cost to them or their families. So our research is specifically focused on the experience in the first 7 schools that opened in New York City. So this is a model that many people have heard of, but we are specifically focused on the first 7 in New York. In terms of the importance of the study, this is the first study of the effectiveness of the model. And so a model that has really rapidly expanded and scaled nationally. So many districts have been investing in implementing the model. And our study aims to provide some evidence of the effectiveness of the model, to also provide insights on implementation and information about costs. So we've got kind of 3 prongs to the study. It's not just focused on the impact side. In terms of the causal design, we're also using a causal experimental design. When we're utilizing an admissions process. So we're utilizing the New York City High School admissions lottery to create comparable groups. So for those who may not be familiar with New York City, in New York City, students have an opportunity to apply to up to 12 high schools that they're interested in attending. And that placement is based on a lottery process where some students apply to oversubscribed schools, and they either randomly win a seat in that school or lose a seat in that school. So for us, our program group are students who are randomly have won a seat and have access to a PTEC school, and the comparison group becomes those students who randomly lost a seat in a PTEC school. Our findings, so luckily we do have some findings. We just put out a report in the spring, so it's relatively new, and that report can be found on the MDRC website, as well as the link on the CTE Research Network's website. And we've been trying to get the word out. So in addition to having the report, we've got a blog, we have an infographic, and we have a podcast. So if you're really interested in getting into the details, there are a lot of different ways to learn about the study. I can give you 1 or 2 points to kick off your thinking about PTEC. So we have found that there are positive interim progress. 70% of the students in our sample were below proficient in 8th grade math and ELA, English Language Arts, and the model seems to be providing success for academically low performing students. At the end of 2 years of high school, 42% of the students in the PTEC schools had passed the ELA New York State Regents exam. So the Regents exam, I think, are pretty particular to New York City or to New York. And in New York, students in high school take Regents exams too as a college readiness exam, and that gains them entrance into the City University of New York schools. And those City University of New York schools, which we refer to as CUNY schools, are schools that are partnered with PTEC. So 42% of students in the PTEC schools had passed the ELA with a score that qualified them for enrollment in CUNY courses, compared with just 25% of students in the comparison group. By the end of 3 years, the gap was smaller, but it still favored the PTEC students. So these pass rates indicate that more PTEC students, were eligible to enroll in dual enrollment in the CUNY coursework. And actually next year, we're going to put out an issue brief where we talk more about dual enrollment. We're collecting that data right now, and we'll analyze that and have a brief out in sometime probably in the spring. So we're finding that the PTEC students were eligible to enroll, and they're doing that earlier than the comparison group students. And we also talk about, this is less on the causal side, but as a complement to the study, the report also gives you insights into the variation in terms of the work-based learning opportunities that are available to students, what their experiences are in terms of workplace visits, job shadowing, internships, and level of participation. So I will pause there, but that's a little bit about the PTEC study.
Great, thank you so much. And Julie, would you like to share some of your research?
Sure. I do want to give folks a heads up. I am in North Carolina, and we're getting the remnants of Hurricane Zeta, so there's a fair amount of wind. So if for some reason I shut down in the middle, it's because our power went out. But so far, so good. So our project is entitled The Evaluation of Career and College Promise, and we're doing it in North Carolina in partnership with the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, the North Carolina Community College System, and RAND Corporation. So Career and College Promise is North Carolina's dual enrollment program, and that includes a pathway where students take dual enrollment CTE courses that are intended to lead to a CTE credential or a career-oriented major at a post-secondary institution. And not sure whether people are familiar with the research on dual enrollment. There is a growing research base on dual enrollment more broadly, but there is actually very, very little research on CTE dual enrollment courses. And so our study is intended to contribute to this research base by exploring implementation questions. So we're going to be looking at things like who's taking CTE dual enrollment courses, why schools might have differing levels of participation. And then we're also going to be looking at the implementation of a career coaching program being implemented in North Carolina to try to encourage students to enroll in these dual enrollment courses. But the key goal of the project is to understand the impact of the CTE pathway. And so we're trying to understand the impact of participation in CTE dual enrollment courses on students' outcomes in high school, on their outcomes in post-secondary education, and in the workforce. Because we've really just started, we're only a year into the project, and it is a 5-year project. We only have descriptive findings at this point. And what we see is that about 12,000 high school students in North Carolina took dual enrollment courses through the CTE pathway. 47% of those students were female. 16% were Hispanic, which is slightly above the state rate proportionally. 16% were African American, which is slightly below our rates, so slightly less proportional. So as I mentioned, we're about a year into our study, and we hope to have results from the impact study, at least on the high school and post-secondary outcomes, within the next year. And maybe we can bring that information to another webinar or to the ACT conference.
Great, thank you so much. As you're talking about your research, CTE teachers and administrators are always interested in how can research be applied to their local settings, or how their work might be influenced by research findings. So maybe Crystal, you could start and share a little bit more about how do your studies, and this can be for all of you, but if Crystal wants to start, how are your studies might be related to the practitioner in a CTE classroom?
Sure. So we really think of practitioners as one of our audiences for the work that we're doing. And it's really, our work is trying to understand what works for improving student outcomes. So if you want to think about course credit accumulation, in New York Regents exam attempts and pass levels, attendance, high school graduation, and college success, the study can provide answers to some of those questions. So that's really answering, kind of getting at the impact effectiveness question. But at the same time, the implementation research can help practitioners really gain some insight into the mechanisms of the model that create the conditions for success. So for whom is the model working, how is it working, and under what conditions is it working, right? And then the cost study aspect really gives you an idea of how much investment is needed to produce those impacts, so that you have an understanding of how to weigh the costs and the benefits against each other, and also figure out what might be feasible in your own environment. I know in a classroom setting, maybe folks are not thinking so much about the cost benefits part of that. So maybe that's more for district administrators who are trying to understand, is this the model that we'd like to bring into our district? But we try to think about these different aspects of the work and how it can help inform the different decision makers, different stakeholders who are in the school system. So maybe I'll pause there and see if Julie or Sean
Right.
want to add to that.
Julie or Sean?
I mean, I can go ahead. So this webinar is focused really on causal studies, which do look at the impact. And I think in that case, our impact study is really designed to inform policymakers and decision makers there. So people who are really trying to make a decision about whether they want to expend resources on things like dual enrollment courses. I do think that those impact findings will also be useful to counselors and advisors as we hopefully learn more about which students benefit from having access to these courses. However, from the non-causal side, we are collecting a lot of data around implementation that I think through more descriptive approaches like surveys and site visits. And I think that those data really are intended to help, as Crystal's talked about, school-based practitioners make better decisions about things like advising and preparing and supporting students in those courses. So, so the causal piece, I would say, highly useful, informative for people that are trying to make decisions about whether to roll out a program or not. And then some of the implementation pieces, much more useful for people that are on the ground and working in classrooms.
Great, thank you. Sean, did you want to add anything at this time, or I can ask you the next question?
So I'll just say briefly that that framing from both Crystal and Julie, I think, applies to the Connecticut study as well, with the possible addition that some of the causal impact estimates on test score outcomes and attendance may suggest to practitioners, right, the relevance or the importance of what, just reinforce, right, what folks are already doing as sort of a external gratification.
Yeah, great. Thank you all. Sean, maybe you could start on this next question, share more on the advantages of a randomized control trial versus some other quasi-experimental approaches.
Sure. So both experimental and quasi-experimental will have the advantage of being able to establish a cause and effect relationship, which, in order to do that, just like in correlational research, you have to establish that there is a relationship between the outcomes and the sort of treatment or a program. The second is you need to show that the treatment happened before the outcome, that it's not reverse causation. And then the third condition you need is to be able to rule out all possible other explanations for the treatment effect. And the reason that randomized control trials are the best is because when they're properly designed, you can know at the outset that the treatment group and the comparison group are equivalent on at least observable characteristics like gender, race, ethnicity, prior test scores, socioeconomic status, and really satisfy the conditions that the only thing that's going to be different between the treated group and the untreated group, or the comparison control group, is the thing that you're trying to test, the program, policy, intervention. And so then you can really be sure that the cause and effect relationship is driven by the treatment. That's mostly true in quasi-experimental studies, but there's usually other things you also have to test in ways that can be more sensitive to deviations from, let's say, perfect randomization in an RCT. And so that's why the randomized control trial has a distinct advantage over correlational work, but even against some other quasi-experimental designs. I mentioned regression discontinuity design, where you sort of have randomization around some cutoff that determined eligibility. The reason that a randomized control trial is preferable to that is it applies to everyone in the treatment group and everyone in the control group. That treatment effect, it's sort of the average across the whole group. Whereas in a regression discontinuity design, you're just near that cutoff, and so you can say, you know, the effect applies to fewer people, essentially.
Yeah, great. Julie or Crystal, did you want to add anything about advantages?
Yeah, I wanted to give maybe a pretty specific example that people could think about relative to this. So, so if we think, for example, that you might be starting this really cool engineering pathway in your school, right? Got all kinds of hands-on experiences that allow students to apply math skills. There's opportunities to participate in robotics competitions, et cetera. So it's really cool. But you only have one teacher who can offer it. So you're limited in the number of students that you can take. And so you can only take about 25 students, but you've got a lot that are interested. Maybe, let's say there's about 75 that are interested. So in order to pick the students who enroll in your program, you decide you want to do an application process and some interviews. And you pick students for the program who have really high math scores and who are super excited about engineering, right? Like, these are the kids that are going to nail this program. At the end, when you look at it, you look at the outcomes for the students, and they are awesome. All the students had great attendance. They performed at the highest level on the state Algebra 2 test. You're so excited, and you want to share the results with the rest of the staff or the district. So what other people think about this, about your findings here, about the results that you're reporting? Some people are going to be really impressed. Some people are going to be like, yeah, that's awesome. Other people who are a bit more skeptical are going to think, and maybe they're going to have a little bubble in their head, a little thought bubble. They may not tell you this, but they're going to think, oh, of course you got great results. You picked kids who already had great test scores, right? Now, if you think about it differently, what if you took the 75 kids who were interested in your program and you just randomly picked 25 of them? So those are interested. And at the end of the program, you looked at the Algebra 2 scores for the students who you randomly selected to attend the program. And then you compared those scores to the students who were interested but didn't get in randomly, right? So these students are the same at this point. If your engineering students had higher math scores at the end, you could say that it was the program that caused you to have those higher math scores and not the fact that you actually picked students who had really high math scores to begin with. So in that case, you're comparing apples to apples. And that's really what randomization does, right? Like Sean was saying, it says that the results that you got from the program, the results that you get, the differences between the two groups that you're comparing come from the program and not from these inherent differences in the characteristics of students that you might have.
Great, thank you for the example. Crystal, did you have anything else to share on that?
I guess just to make the point that I think both Julia and Sean made, which is that an RCT really does gives you the greatest confidence in your findings, I think, and rules out the selection bias piece, which I think shows up in the example that Julie shared.
Yeah. So to follow up, sometimes educators have concerns about randomized controlled trials. So what are some of those concerns that you've heard, and then how do you respond to those concerns? So maybe Julie, if you want to start, maybe using your example that you were just using.
Sure. Actually, I've done a longitudinal experimental study looking at early colleges. And so as part of that, I've had lots of conversations with people about randomization and whether to do randomization or not. And from my experience, people generally have two concerns. And so the first one is that really, if you're doing this, you're denying services to students, right? And the second concern is that many people actually believe that they can select the students who will most likely benefit from the program. And I think both of these are really legitimate concerns. And I want to share how I talk with people about them. So the first concern about denying services really depends on the assumption that your program is actually better than what was already happening to students. And this may or may not be true. For example, you may decide to introduce a literacy program for your CTE students where you pull students out of a regular class and then you give them intensive literacy instruction. Maybe this increases their literacy, but you're making them miss out on some other instruction, and that might have negative impacts. And actually, when we look at results, there are many programs, when people do a rigorous study, they don't have any impact at all. So they didn't make any difference. They weren't doing any better than what was already going on in the school. And then actually there are some that have negative impacts where students participating in the program actually had worse results. And so we always need to keep in mind that the program that you're testing may not actually work. And that's hard because people like believe in their programs and they want to do these because they believe they're going to make a difference. But until you really test it, you actually don't know if it's going to make a difference. Now, that being said, I think the ideal situation for a randomized control trial is when you actually have more interest than you can accommodate. So like Sean was talking about, where you have, and like my example with the engineering program, you have a lot more interest than you want to, than you really can accommodate. And so the economic terms that we use in high school, that's the demand is higher than the supply. And so when you have this kind of situation, you can actually make a decision about who receives those services in a random way. And that gives you a really great opportunity for a really strong impact study. Now, this leads to the second concern that people often have, which is that they really believe that they can select students who will benefit from the program. They know their target population, they know who's going to do well in this program. My question to these people always is how do you know? How do you know who's going to benefit actually? And I also really encourage people to think about the inherent biases that we all have and that we bring to the table. Maybe people pick a student for a program because they really like the way she smiles or the student makes them laugh. Maybe they don't pick a student because he doesn't speak standard English and they think he won't do well academically. Recent events obviously have highlighted how we all make decisions based on things that are totally unrelated to the desired outcomes. The randomization does remove that potential bias, and it can be a fairer way of selecting students. You can also conduct randomization in a way that allows you to prioritize certain populations. So if you really feel like first-generation college goers would benefit most from your program, you can design a lottery such that those students are more likely to be selected.
Great.
So we regularly continue to do lotteries for schools in North Carolina. Our study, actually, we started doing it as part of a study. Once that study was over, I thought, oh, thank God I don't have to do this anymore. But we actually had a bunch of schools that wanted to continue doing the lottery, and we still do that with them. And the main reason we do is because the schools believe that a lottery is fairer to the students. And the other reason is because it gives them a better reason or a better way of responding to a mama that might call them and say, why did my kid not get into your program? And and instead of saying, well, your kid wasn't good enough for the program, they can say something like, it was just the luck of the draw.
Great. And I want to give Crystal and Sean an opportunity to respond as well. But just a reminder to participants that if you have concerns or you've heard concerns and aren't sure how to address those, you could ask the panel about that as well now in the chat box if you want to. So Crystal or Sean, did you want to add anything about those concerns you hear?
Yeah, I would just add that sometimes you find yourself in a situation where a funder requires that you do random assignment, right? So if there is no random assignment or there is no program, and so sometimes that's just kind of the hard facts. And so you have to kind of think about the fact that there wasn't a service to begin with. So random assignment is actually giving some students an opportunity, if it's in a school-based setting, an opportunity to participate and to learn whether there's something that's effective that in the end might benefit everyone if you found out that there were effects. I would also share, and I can send this to Steve afterward, there's a great article that was written maybe around 2017. I think it's in the Nonprofit Quarterly, and there's an executive director who talks about taking on the burden of what felt like the burden of random assignment in the beginning and how that helped because they were able to learn more about their program in a more systematic way. And there were some bumps along the road. There's some things that you do have to kind of think about, and maybe you don't want to put too much burden on the research subjects, but there are just some things that you need to do in order to participate. And it really gives you some nice insight from someone who was skeptical in the beginning, got his group through random assignment, and now they're able to use that information and also to help them in fundraising because now they have a study that's proven that their program has been effective. And so I think maybe some of the folks here on the call might appreciate that. So I can share that link with Steve afterwards.
Yeah, that would be. I think there are a lot of CTE administrators who would like to see that article. That's great. Sean, did you want to add anything else?
More just on the ability to generalize from a randomized control trial. So this is less an objection on the front end, but to Crystal's point specifically about when a funder requires you to randomize, you need to go out and find volunteers, right, who will participate. And sometimes the volunteers are different than the whole population that you care about. Right. And so then that can lead to sometimes skepticism on the back end that the individuals or schools that were included in the randomized control trial are not representative of the population to which you're trying to apply it. And so in those instances, being able to look at kind of characteristics of the place that wants to use the evidence or the setting that wants to use the evidence, and then seeing whether or not it's similar to the individuals or schools that participated in the study can be helpful.
Yeah, great point. Thank you. And again, if anybody has any questions for our panelists, please feel free to put those in the chat box. I will continue since our webinar is talking about causal research. Why might causal research be considered the holy grail of research, or what makes it important? And Julie, if you want to start on this one.
Sure, again, I wouldn't necessarily use the term holy grail, actually, because that kind of implies that you're reaching some pinnacle and the causal research is the solution. And really, causal research is very good at answering some questions, right? Like, does a program work better than what you were already doing? That's the main question. And it's really not very good at answering other questions, like who's participating or why does a project work? So actually, I think of causal research as sort of in the middle of the research chain, if we think about it. So researchers often start out, they're doing lots of exploratory, descriptive research to see relationships between different variables. Maybe think about what makes a good intervention. And this is something that educators really do intuitively through their own experience. But once an intervention is developed, causal research is really good at determining whether it works better than what you already had in place. But then once you know whether a program works or not, there's lots of follow-up questions. How does it work? Who does it work for? Does it work the same in all settings? And those questions actually can be answered, some through causal research, but some of them need other designs.
Great. Sean or Crystal, do you want to add to that?
So I'll just add a piece about why I think it is particularly important in career and technical education research, because we often worry about in descriptive studies, right, omitted variables or factors, possible confounding variables, like Michelle raised earlier, that could explain the outcome that we're not including in our analysis. So I was a high school teacher and administrator that worked with students that attended a technical center and was administrative liaison to our technical center in Pennsylvania. And I perceived that the students that were heavily invested in CTE were more motivated, whether it's because they understood the job market or they had family members or community members that encouraged them to pursue these pathways. But as a researcher, I worry a lot about, right, the things that I couldn't observe, that I observed but weren't in my data about. And so I'll just say that in particular in CTE, where there could be unobserved factors that matter, it's really helpful to be able to rule those out, and that's part of what causal methods can get us.
Yeah, great, thank you. Crystal, did you want to add anything else?
Yeah, I would just say that, I mean, in terms of like CTE, we know there's a lot of focus on CTE, right? And so I think what this type of evaluation can do for us is help us understand, like, where should we be spending our resources? Where do we invest? What do we know? What intervention works and creates success for students? I think at the end of the day, that's where we want to be. And there are a lot of ideas that I think conceptually make sense and it feels like they would work, but we don't always know. And so here's an opportunity to really figure out, of the limited resources we have, where do we invest our dollars to help support students?
Great. So as we think about, in addition to causality, and maybe Crystal, you could share you've talked a little bit about some of the other methodologies that you're using in the CTE Research Network in your research, but maybe you could share a little bit more about those other methodologies and how those are contributing as well.
Yeah, so we have a big implementation research component, I think similar to some of the other studies in the network. And so we're doing survey research, we're doing interviews with a set of stakeholders who are engaged in the PTech endeavor. So that's speaking to students, school informants. So if that's at the local school level as well as the post-secondary level, and trying to gain insights from employers because they're a big part of the PTech model. And also pulling program documentation as well. So we do a lot of, there was a time where we did a lot of site visits, and we'll see what that looks like going forward. But spending time, I'm really trying to understand. And when I think about the implementation work, I think about it as kind of looking under the hood to really understand what's happening, kind of what are the mechanisms that are helping this program to either be successful or to not be successful. What are the challenges? What are the successes? And so these data really provide a lot more information for us about course taking, work-based learning experiences, program implementation, and challenges. And I think that helps to kind of round out some of the questions around the does it work or does it not, trying to explain, giving us more explanation around that. I mean, the cost study is just really helpful in terms of trying to figure out, what does it take to get to this point, and how do we spend these dollars, and where are the dollars being spent? So together across the board, we're really doing a lot on the qualitative side through the surveys and using the surveys to collect information also about the cost study. So we're gleaning some of our information about the cost study from interviews, surveys, and then publicly available data. So it's really pulling on a lot of different levers to try to understand for this model what's working, what's not working, and just providing some feedback for schools that are currently engaged, as well as those schools that might be thinking this might be a model that we want to pursue going forward.
Thank you. It really shares like how important it is to know that causal research piece, but also to have the full picture of how is CTE perceived and how is it seen across the board. So that's great. Sean or Julie, did you want to share anything additional that you're working on in your methodologies?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I totally agree with what Crystal said. I mean, all of our studies have lots of mixed methods involved. And so, because I think you need to get that full picture. And so the way that I like to talk about it is a little bit is that qualitative data helps you understand what the story is. And then quantitative data tells you sort of how frequent that story is.
Great.
Both of them together are necessary.
Great, thanks. Sean, did you have anything to add?
So when covering or mentioning the Connecticut study earlier, I did not mention that I'm part of another team that is otherwise not fully represented on the panel, which is a team based at New York University, also studying CTE in New York City and capitalizing on naturally occurring lotteries, randomized controlled trials in the broader high school admissions process. So implicitly, I guess it probably includes the PTech schools, but we're not doing the sort of close look and deep dive that MDRC is around PTech, but sort of CTE programs and lotteried admissions into those programs, and some naturally occurring rank order programs that lend themselves to a regression discontinuity design. Here, I'll just say that because that's happening on such a large scale in the largest school district in the country, there's going to be lots of variation in the treatment effect. So to say that some schools and programs may have a really large positive effect, others may have a negative effect, and on average across all the lotteries, it could look like there's zero effect of CTE. You're getting into one of these CTE programs, and that's a long introduction to saying we're looking at some of these implementation documents, evidence about program quality, program differences that can give us insight into why there's variation in the effect. And so I think I'm just doubling up on points already made, but like making sure to mention this other network team member as well.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing. That's good information. I think we all are in CTE, we're always looking at, how do we recruit the right students to the right programs? And so it sounds like all of the research that you're doing really lend themselves to helping CTE programs determine that in the long run. So that's great. As we near the end of our time, Is there anything important to this topic that maybe we have not talked about that you think our CTE practitioner audience would want to know about? And Crystal, why don't we start with you on this one?
Sure. So I think, we need, as researchers, we need the practitioners to do our work. So we just want to kind of give a shout out to the practitioners that, it's really important, particularly when we do the implementation research, right? We're coming into schools. We want to sit and talk with you about your experience, ask you to help us understand what this looks like on the ground. So that's really important. And also that the practitioners help us understand, like, where are there gaps in the evidence base, like help so that we're not just going off coming up with our own ideas about what we should study, but really grounding it on what's needed in the field. So I just wanted to kind of put that plug in there, that the practitioner experience is really important and a vital part of the work that we do.
Yeah, great. Sean or Julie, did you want to add anything else?
I think I'd like to encourage people to be thinking about the potential of impact studies from the beginning as you all are thinking about planning and implementing implementing interventions, sorry. And just be open to the idea of maybe having some randomness in selection of participants, especially if you get more interest than you can accommodate. So if you are able to randomize your students up front, you can get a good sense of whether your program works or not. And you can do that simply by comparing the outcomes for the two groups. Those who are interested in randomly accepted and those who are interested in not randomly accepted. And to do that, if the randomization works, you don't need to do any sophisticated analyses. You don't have to do anything more complicated beyond tracking the outcomes for those two groups and just comparing them. And so I think there are a lot more opportunities for these kinds of studies than people normally assume. And I think I would like to encourage practitioners too to recognize that you don't have to be a super sophisticated methodologist to do these studies. You can do them. And again, if that randomization works, it takes care of a lot of that stuff that statisticians have to do in order to account for these differences. And you can just look at the difference between the two groups and see what happens.
Great, thank you. Sean, any final words?
To tie the sort of end back to the beginning with the research network and our charge, one of the elements of the work of the network over the first 2 years was to do kind of a outreach and feasibility study to understand, like, what are the untapped opportunities to understand the causal impact of CTE. And it relied on ACTE and our professional networks to try and contact practitioners to find opportunities where maybe RCTs could happen, or maybe there's natural experiments, quasi-experimental designs that sort of could be analyzed. And just to emphasize the fact that you all know what's happening. You know the sort of state of play in your schools and districts and policy settings, and we don't. So I think that there are some potential natural partnerships. I think we all represent partnerships across these projects with practitioners and policymakers, and without that, we can't do more of the work. So I really appreciate that Julie made the point that it can be done locally, and the more we do that, the more we'll know. But then if there are larger scale things that folks are interested in doing or know have happened and could be evaluated, we're happy to help, play matchmaker to folks who maybe are located nearby or also have a connection to the policy context and could help expand the base.
Great, thank you. So with that, Steve, I will turn it back over to you if there's anything else that you wanted to add here at the end.
The only thing is to thank our panelists and you, Michelle. I think this was terrific information. As they know from planning for this event, I myself need more study on these topics and to learn more about causal research, what it does, and what the other methodologies can do. So it's really helpful to have the knowledge sources who are actually in the middle of this doing that work. So thank you very much. Brandy, I think there's also a final slide. If people have questions, either for our panelists or for ACTE or the CTE Research Network, we're going to put up my email address. It's at the very end. And you're welcome to email me. Well, maybe it's not. I thought it was in there. But my email address, there it is. you're welcome to call or email me, and we're happy to answer your questions. We'd love to hear your thoughts and about what else you might need related to this or other topics. So thank you very much and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.